very happy that you could all join us. And of course, our guest of honor, Barbara Smith, celebrating her first century and the first century that she's going to be working with us. And we're looking forward to the second century that she will also be working with us. To start off, as is very appropriate, I'd like to ask one of her current students, Erin Salah, to deliver us the opening Oli. Our first panelist is David Gere, who was at Hawaii from 1983 to 1985, and his area was India, although he did his work, his final thesis on the work of Meredith Monk. His presentation today is going to be An Ethnomusicologist Embraces Arts Activism. So please, David, we're looking forward to your presentation. Aloha.
Thank you, Rick. I must say it's so moving to be here with all of you and to be gathered around Ms. Smith. For the past 2 weeks, all around the world, people have bravely emerged from coronavirus quarantine to protest the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police, a racist act memorably characterized by the Reverend Al Sharpton as a white knee to the neck of the Black man. These protests, remarkable for their peacefulness, have featured a dizzying array of creative expressions, from the eye-poppingly visual, hand-scrawled signs, vivid paintings, colorful murals of George Floyd's face, to the musical, including chants of "No justice, no peace," and the supremely artful call and response of a Minneapolis church organ slipping betwixt and between the words of Reverend Sharpton's eulogy for Floyd. I begin by acknowledging the present moment because I have to, because it would be ridiculous to talk about arts activism and ethnomusicology without opening our ears to the sounds of this time. I do this also because I want to draw a line between ethnomusicology as practiced and taught by Professor Barbara B. Smith, whose 100th birthday we celebrate today. Happy birthday, Miss Smith. And the movements for social justice we now witness in full bloom around the world. I discern a link between them, Miss Smith and social justice, which begins with the basic impulse at the heart of ethnomusicology, the desire to understand other human beings through the sounds that they create, to honor and respect those sonic creations, and to listen, to really listen, as perhaps only an ethnomusicologist can. I came to the music department at UH in the early 1980s to listen and to learn from Miss Smith, from Rick Trimillos, and from the good colleagues they had arrayed around themselves at the Mānoa campus. While teaching at a small college in South India, I had fallen in love with a pair of interconnected South Indian art forms, Bharatanatyam and Carnatic singing, the latter of which I was privileged to study at the feet of an esteemed master musician, Sri Shankara Shivan, who lived in Madurai, south of Chennai. When I sat cross-legged at my guru's feet, I sang like the good Western classically trained singer that I was, with a warm vibrato, a full tone, conveniently leaving out the complex gamakas or ornaments of South Indian music, partly, I'm embarrassed to admit, because I couldn't hear them, And partly, I'm even more embarrassed to admit, because at some level, I thought there was something wrong with them. Ironically, I needed to come to Oahu to study with Gayatri Rajapur Kasabaum in order to be able to hear the nuances of Carnatic music, the tonal sophistication, the laser-focused pitch, and most importantly, those remarkable gamakas. What did it take for the Tyagaraja Kirtanai to get through my thick skull? Careful analysis, precision, patience, and close listening. All things championed by Miss Smith. And all things that, though they appear at first blush to be antithetical to the noisy, impulsive, even chaotic aspects of activist protest, are in fact crucial to the success of arts activism. These qualities, Miss Smith's qualities, came to my aid in 2007, when, with Gideon Mendel, I began to develop Through Positive Eyes, a photo storytelling project by and for people living with HIV and AIDS around the world. The impulse for the project originated with A Broken Landscape, a 2001 book of photographs by the South African photographer Gideon Mendel, which I had found in my teaching at UCLA to be remarkably successful at shifting the politics of representation for people living with HIV in Southern Africa, which, as you know, is one of the epicenters of the global AIDS epidemic. The photography of the epidemic, dating back to its official beginnings in the early 1980s, reinforced victimhood, bodies wasting away in isolation, configured as objects of pity. By contrast, Gideon Mendel's photographs depicted human beings with HIV as strong and energetic advocates for themselves and for one another. Each of Mendel's portraits was accompanied by a first-person text offering a glistening point of entry and identification for the reader. Some of these texts were literally about activism, about organizations joined or speeches given. Others recounted the simple joys of daily life, the sound of the radio, the feeling of sunlight on your back. In aggregate, these texts affirmed people living with HIV as vital actors, living, even if seriously ill, and approachable, even if constrained by social isolation. Gideon Mendel's photographic method, born from his participation in the anti-apartheid movement as a Jewish South African struggle photographer, seemed to me so exemplary and so exciting that I cold called him in London, where he had moved with his family, to offer praise and to see if he would consider working together with my UCLA Art and Global Health Center. For starters, I invited him to visit UCLA to apply his method to people living with HIV, not in South Africa, his home place, but in Los Angeles, my home place. The results of that pilot project were so promising that with support from the Ford Foundation and later the Herb Ritz Foundation, we were able together, Gideon and I, from 2008 to the present day, to run a long series of 10-day photo storytelling workshops in major cities. Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, Johannesburg, Washington, DC, Mumbai, Bangkok, Port-au-Prince, London, and Durban. 4 years ago, we collected the images and stories from these workshops into a traveling Through Positive Eyes exhibition, which has now been seen in Durban, Johannesburg, and Cape Town in South Africa, and also in Los Angeles, moving soon to Seattle, to the Gates Discovery Center, which, as many of you know, is the public-facing unit of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. On account of the coronavirus, we've been unable to hold our customary face-to-face workshop in Seattle. Instead, starting next month, we're organizing a 20-session online workshop using the Zoom platform, the very platform we're on right now, to teach photography and storytelling to a dozen HIV-positive Seattle artivists. We call them artivists because they are artists and activists at the same time. Throughout the decade-plus history of the project, Gideon and I, both HIV negative and both committed allies to people living with HIV, have kept our focus on two goals. One, supporting the self-efficacy of people living with HIV, and two, overcoming the stigma associated with HIV around the world, which has tragically prevented so many from getting tested and seeking treatment. Over the years, as I focused on the storytelling aspects of the project, Gideon has gradually put down his own camera in order to focus on his role as a photo educator and editor, placing cameras in the hands of people living with HIV so that they could become masters of their own representation. This has resulted in a major shift in the project. The photography has become more intimate, showing family members and domestic scenes to which no outside photographer could have gained access. Most significantly, the images arrive on our screens quite literally through HIV-positive eyes. From their perspective, viewers are able to perceive the world as it is for a person who lives with HIV every day, heightening our collective awareness of the debilitating stigma that accompanies HIV and AIDS. The hope of all of us who work on the project is that the photo stories of Through Positive Eyes will serve to banish stigma so that finally people living with HIV are free to live and love as they please. I conclude my presentation today by sharing with you a short video by Gideon Mendel that takes all of us into the heart of Raju's experience with HIV, Raju from Mumbai. The music is by two artists, Carnatic singer Vidya Shah, specially commissioned from her home in New Delhi to create a score for the Mumbai Through Positive Eyes videos, and sitarist Shima Mukherjee, who is based in London and is perhaps best known for her membership in Transglobal Underground. I offer up this video as a demonstration of the Through Positive Eyes project and as a gift to Miss Smith on her 100th birthday.
मेरा नाम राजू। पहले पॉजिटिव होके मैं अंधेरे हो गया। उसी टाइम में ब्लड का वो लोग चेकअप करने लगा तो उसका पॉजिटिव करके रिजल्ट आया। एक मिस्टेक की वजह से मेरा लाइफ बिगड़ गया। मेरा फैमिली मेरे ऊपर जी रहे, ऐसा हो गया। अभी क्या करूँ समझ में नहीं आ रहा था। ऊपर गया था बिल्डिंग के ऊपर, मैं सुसाइड करूँगा। वाला बात थोड़ा टाइम रुका, फिर नहीं ऐसा लोग हज़ारों लोग हैं होगा ऐसा, तो उससे जाने दो, अपना लाइफ दूसरा लाइफ चालू हो गया अभी। वाला दूसरा लाइफ मिल गया। घर पे आने के बाद वाइफ को कैसे बताओ, हम लोग फिर दोनों, वो और मैं, फिर 8 दिन के बाद ऐसे ही बाहर लेके गया उसको, ऐसा हो गया करके आराम से समझाया। थोड़ा वो भी टेंशन में हो गया। बाद में उसको समझा के फिर हॉस्पिटल लेके गया, फिर उसका चेकअप किया तो उसका नेगेटिव निकला। मैं बोला थैंक गॉड, वो तो बच गया। हम लोग ने डिसाइड किया अभी क्या करो ज़िंदगी, अभी उसका नेगेटिव मैं पॉजिटिव, कैसे रहने का तुम्हारा ऊपर है। तुमको रहने का है तो रह सकते हैं, अगर नहीं रहने का तो मैं खुद डाइवर्ट दे देता हूँ। आपका ज़िंदगी जैसा है ऐसा तुम्हारा इच्छा। मेरा वाइफ शादी हो गया, अभी 1 ईयर हो गया, गया साल में। अभी धीरे धीरे मेरा उजाला आ रहा है मेरा ज़िंदगी में। कैमरा मेरे हाथ में आने के बाद ऐसा मेरे को लगा मेरा ज़िंदगी में एक नया एक चांस मिला मेरे को। मेरा ज़िंदगी का भी फ़ोटोग्राफी निकालूं और मैं एक अच्छा फ़ोटोग्राफर बनूं इससे। मेरा लाइफ में तो सब मिक्सिंग ही है, सुखी दुखी अंधेरा उजाला सब है। इसके लिए मैं सोचा मेरा इसमें फ़ोटोग्राफी में भी पूरा मिक्स होना मांगता है मेरा लाइफ का। जितना जने पॉजिटिव लोग को मैं यही संदेश देना चाहता हूँ, मेरा जैसा ज़िंदगी किसी को नहीं आना चाहिए, और मेरे से तकलीफ़ हो मेरे को देख के आराम से खुशी से जियो। मेरा लाइफ इतना तकलीफ़ में है फिर भी मैं खुशी से जी रहा हूँ, मेरा जैसा आप लोग भी जियो करके मैं उन लोग को बोलना चाहता हूँ।
Thank you very much, David, for your presentation. And thanks particularly for the video. And we'll see you later at the party. We'll go on now to our second presentation, which is by Henry Spiller. Henry was at Hawaii from 1979 to 1980, was studying Indonesia. And his paper today will be a presentation on Between Two Worlds, Jaap Kunst, R.M.A. Kusumadinata, and Theories of the Genesis of Sundanese Scales and Modes. So this shows the range of things that the students from Barbara Smith have done.
Thanks very much, Rick, and aloha to everybody out there, all these familiar faces. It's very nostalgic. And a special happy birthday, Selamat Ulang Tahun, to Miss Smith, who I still have trouble calling Barbara. And but I want Miss Smith to know how much I admire her and what an inspiration she remains to me, not only in terms of her amazing editorial skills, but as I'm sitting here thinking about how to respond to make my music department more amenable to social justice, to figure out ways of doing that, it suddenly occurred to me that Miss Smith had done that in the past by leveraging her own privilege to empower people with less privilege around her to take part in the music department at the University of Hawaii. And I think that's a model that worked well for the last 50 or 60 years, and that we should all think about figuring out how to do that for ourselves. Now, I've actually pre-recorded my lecture because I am terrified of technical glitches. So please enjoy my 14-minute paper. Erik Moritz von Hornbostel and Raden Makyar Angga Kusumadinata were only dimly aware of each other's existence. But their ties to a third party, Jaap Kunst, personify complex power relationships between armchair scientists, field workers, and native informants in early 20th century musicology to demonstrate, first, how deep-seated cultural paradigms affect even the most objective scientific work, and second, how power imbalances also influence research outcomes. In 1919, Kunst, then a young lawyer and amateur violinist, embarked on a concert tour of the Netherlands colonies in the East Indies. He was entranced by the gamelan music he heard there and remained on Java to learn more about it. After participating in a congress on traditional Javanese arts, hosted in 1921 by Raden Tumenggung Arya Wiranatakusuma V, he co-published with Wiranatakusuma a wide-ranging inventory of Sundanese ensembles and genres that includes copious pitch measurements of instruments. Hornbostel reports that it was, quote, a little packet of reprints from the periodical Jowo, in which, in 1921, likely this article that first introduced him to Kunst's work. He wrote, "These measurements were particularly satisfying to me personally, since they constituted an astonishing confirmation of a hypothesis concerning the genesis of tone systems through the cycle of blown fifths, which I had propounded 2 years previously without, however, having published it." As the quintessential armchair ethnomusicologist, Hornbostel speculated, based on a Chinese legend, that ancient Chinese theorists developed scales based on blown fifths and promulgated such scales throughout their sphere of influence, and that these scales persist into contemporary practice. He wrote, quote, "I would like to believe that it is the origin of all instrumental scales of the world, and in any case of heuristic value in bringing order into chaos." The cycle of blown fifths begins with pitch 0, which Hornbostel set at 366 Hz, based on his interpretation of a Chinese treatise. Each subsequent pitch, designated with a Roman numeral, is determined by ascending the interval that Hornbostel claimed was the result of overblowing a stopped pipe to its second overtone. A fifth, which was, according to Hornbostel, 678, audibly smaller than the second overtone of a string, which leads to a perfect fifth at 702 cents. In his 1948 defense of blown fifths, Kunst argues that the theory is compelling because, quote, "a large number of exotic scales found in use among people widely separated historically and geographically may be derived in some regular manner from that cycle of blown fifths." Kunst went to great lengths to show how the primary Javanese tuning systems, the heptatonic pelog and the pentatonic slendro, could be derived in some regular manner from the cycle, in several stages of those scales' historical development, no less. The sorts of regular manner he outlines are actually quite Byzantine. For example, he posited a theoretical primitive slendro in which the pitches were generated by selecting tones that were 12 blown fifths apart, 0, 11, 22, back around to 10, 21. Hornbostel and Kunst took it as a given that musical scales were determined from the physical characteristics of musical tones. Mark Perlman writes persuasively about what he calls the naturalist project in the Western tradition about writing about music, the persistent attempt to ground music in nature by determining the intervals of music mathematically by numerical ratios. Jose Maceda, however, theorizes that the finger holes for bamboo flutes in many parts of Southeast Asia were drilled according to measurements made of the bamboo tubes, so that their tuning is derived from the physical placement of holes in symmetrical visual patterns, rather than on acoustics, overtones, or the perception of sound. Visual equidistance still plays a crucial role in tuning Sundanese wind instruments. Two instrument makers I consulted, Akim and Toto, both demonstrated to me how they take physical measurements to determine the equidistant placement of finger holes in the taliot, a shawm, and the suling, bamboo flute, that they make. In other words, visual symmetry provides a regulating principle for scales for Southeast Asia in general, in the same way that Greek notions of overtones underlie Western notions of scale generation. Although Raden Mahyar Angga Kusumadinata's name appears as co-author on Kunst's 1929 article Een en ander over Slendro en Pelog that cites Hornbostel's blown fifths theory, I doubt Kusumadinata ever endorsed it. In his own approach to theorizing Sundanese scales and modes, Kusumadinata leaned consistently toward equidistance and the divisive paradigm. Although Helmholtz discounted equidistance as a viable principle for the construction of scales, Alexander Ellis concluded that, quote, "the equal division of the octave into 5 pentatones of 240 cents is probably the unrecognized ideal of the slendro tuner." For Slendro, Kusumadinata began by following Ellis's lead to divide the octave into 5 equal intervals to create an anhemitonic pentatonic scale. In West Java, it's a common practice to overlay hemitonic pentatonic modes, sometimes called surupan, on the accompaniment of instruments tuned to Slendro, so that the surupan will include 1 medium or Slendro interval, 2 much smaller intervals, and 2 much larger intervals. For example, the Sorog interval pattern is descending from high to low. Start small, large, small, medium, large. To account for these Slendro-compatible scales, Kusumadinata further divided each interval in half, resulting in 10 equal subdivisions of the octave. So, in this version, the large intervals would be 360 cents, while the small intervals are 120 cents. I'll illustrate the practice using a recording made in 1958 by Kunst's student Mantle Hood that features Kusumadinata's own rabab playing. In this example, he plays in Sorog, while the other musicians play in Slendro. To Kusumadinata's ear, the theoretical 120 set intervals did not sound quite right. He next tried dividing the octave into 15 equal parts at 80 cents each, fine-tuning the small intervals down to 80 cents and the large intervals up to 400 cents. The medium-sized intervals remained at 240 cents. Still not satisfied, and by now convinced that Slendro was not equidistant, he finally came up with the notion of dividing the octave into 17 equal parts, with 70.58 cents each. For Slendro, he posited 2 interval sizes, 212 cents and 282 cents, instead of a single 240 cent interval. For Sorog, then, the small intervals were 71 cents and the large intervals 424 cents. So Kusumadinata's various models of Sorog result in the following pitches and intervals. Note that the prescribed pitches in the various models vary by as much as 50 cents, a full quarter tone, which is easily audible. Kusumadinata worked out a complex system of modes and submodes based on the principles of the system, and he built musical instruments tuned to these microtonal systems. It is not my goal here to explain fully the gruesome details of these various scales and models, but rather to impart how zealously Kusumadinata was committed to explaining Sundanese practice with equidistant models, in direct distinction with Kunst's equally zealous devotion to overtones and to Hornbostel's theory of blown fifths. In Music in Java, Kunst gently disrespects Kusumadinata's approach. Quote, "One may well content oneself, as Kusumadinata has shown by means of his experimental instruments, with an equidistant scale of 10 steps, in much the same way as European music manages to do with its equally tempered scale of 12 semitones." And for Kunst, this final 17-pitch equidistant system was simply too much. When Kusumadinata shared it with Kunst in a letter, Kunst responded, quote, "Your announcement that you have come to distinguish a total of 17 steps in Slendro startled me. At first, Slendro seemed so harmless with its 5 steps, then it became 10. Now it is 17. Where does this lead us?" A version of Kusumadinata's theory of Sundanese modal practice continues to be taught at the government-sponsored Arts Institute in Bandung, and it is indubitable that aspects of Kusumadinata's terminology, notational systems, and modal theory have influenced the development of Sundanese music since the 1950s. But it's apparent to both insiders and outsiders that Kusumadinata's equidistant theories do not describe Sundanese musical practice very well. Andrew Weintraub suggests that, quote, "the models are unassailable because of the legendary status of their author, grafting Sundanese notions of respect for elders and modern 20th century Indonesian ideals of so-called guided democracy, that is, authoritarianism, onto music theory." Kusumadinata's models certainly have fared better than the theory of blown fifths. That theory fell out of favor after Manfred Buchhofzer successfully challenged the foundational physics of Hornbostel's flawed notion of a blown fifth, and it's universally discounted in the present. For the most part, Javanese musicians and theorists do not look for precise predictive models for Javanese tunings, but rather revel in their variability and ambiguity. According to Perlman, quote, Javanese ways of thinking about intonation owe nothing to mathematical ratios, to ideas of harmonic partials, or to acoustical or psychoacoustical research. They are based instead on concepts of individuality, voice, and feeling. So I think it's fair to say that Kunst, Hornbostel, and even Kusumadinata all were barking up the wrong tree in their pursuit of rationales for Javanese intonation. Ellis wrote, of course, practice preceded theory in music as in everything else. To reverse the process is very risky indeed. Hornbostel, with Kunst's help, engaged in exactly the sort of reverse engineering that Ellis warned against. So convinced were they that humans rooted their tunings in overtone series, they turned to the dubious blown fifths when Pythagorean fifths failed. Kusumadinata, in contrast, had a completely different, if equally wrong-headed instinct, prompted perhaps by a clearly demonstrable tradition in Java of equidistant models for musical instruments. He developed equidistant models to explain the intonational nuances he heard. What lessons can we learn from these interlocking, if contradictory, approaches to theory? First, it's clear that unconscious epistemological biases affect even the most objective scientific work. Hornbostel's, Kunst's, and Kusumadinata's approaches to theory were rooted in their own subconsciously held epistemologies of music, yet none of them adequately accounted for Javanese practices. Second, we must remain aware of power differentials between the various actors, scientist, field worker, and native informant, in evaluating their conclusion. All three men's work was affected by their complex power interrelationships. Kunst's measurements and in-the-field detail validated Hornbostel's grand universalist theories, and in return, Hornbostel's phonogram archive validated Kunst's legitimacy as a researcher. Kusumadinata's native status informed and validated Kunst's analyses, and in return, Kunst's status as a colonial overlord validated Kusumadinata's expertise. In the words of Harja Susilo, quote, we are talking about a musical culture which tolerates more variants of tuning systems than that of the West. When talking about embat, that is, intervallic relationship, one may hear remarks such as not comfortable, not quite comfortable, more comfortable, comfortable, very comfortable, as opposed to the Western way, which differentiates right and wrong. So perhaps our third lesson should be to take a cue from Pat Susilo and assess the theories of Hornbostel, Kunst, and Kusumadinata not as right or wrong per se, but rather as more or less comfortable. We should consider not only musical sounds, but the politics and aesthetics of musical, scholarly, colonial, and political interactions as well. Thank you.
Our final speaker for today is Nancy Guy, who was at Hawaii from 1985 to 87. Her specialization is China. And today she will be sharing her paper on child prodigies as cultural ambassadors, Western art music and foreign relations in mid-20th century Taiwan. So you can see we have a full range of topics that Barbara, of course, has been very interested in her own career. Nancy, please present your paper. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that introduction, Rick. First, I just want to say that unfortunately, I never had a chance to work directly with Ms. Smith. She had already retired when I got to UH, but she was a constant presence and inspiration, and I'm really happy to be here today to help celebrate her 100th birthday. So thank you all. So before I dive into this paper, I just want to first situate this research in the context of a new larger scale project that I'm working on, in which I'll be investigating the propagation of Western art music in Taiwan with a concentration on the 1960s and 1970s. These decades were remarkable since it was during this period that state and institutional support for so-called classical music rapidly expanded. It was also the period when the first crop of Taiwanese child prodigies was being trained, many of whom went on to enjoy international careers. Fundamental questions stemming from my early investigation include the following. Why did the ROC government become involved in supporting this foreign-derived music? How did state policies influence the education and training of young musicians? Why did families choose to make the heavy financial and time sacrifices necessary to support their children's education in this distinctly Western performance tradition? And what did Western music represent to these families, and importantly to the ROC government, as they invested limited financial resources in the years before Taiwan's economic miracle? So here today, I focus on an early instance of the Republic of China's use of Western art music as a tool for international diplomacy. In September 1969, the ROC deployed a 54-member youth orchestra to Manila, where it performed at the opening festivities for the Cultural Center of the Philippines. The Republic of China Children's Symphony Orchestra was formed especially for this event. The CSO gave 6 performances in Manila, including one for a private party at the Presidential Palace. The ROC Ministry of Education's Cultural Affairs Office covered the tour expenses. This support not only included paying the travel costs for the children and 12 accompanying adults, but also the hiring of Helen Kwok, who would conduct the ensemble. Kwok was born in the Philippines and trained in Australia. At the time of the tour, she was arguably one of the world's most prominent orchestral conductors of Chinese descent. The CSO trip to the Philippines invites us to question what motivated the ROC government to underwrite and organize this operation. As I describe in a longer version of this paper, the venture was impeccably curated. No detail of the group's presentation was left to happenstance. The tour was an example of cultural diplomacy. That is, it essentially represented an interest-driven governmental practice. Cultural diplomacy was an important vehicle employed by the nationalist regime as it struggled to assert its standing as a legitimate government of China, particularly from the 1960s through the 1970s. The 3 years prior to the tour witnessed a good deal of exchange between Taiwan and the Philippines, beginning with the declaration of a Sino-Philippine Friendship Year in March 1966. However, Helen Kwok's musical successes in the Philippines appears to be the factor that led most directly to the invitation. When Kwok landed in Taiwan in late June 1969, after having given 5 triumphant performances in Manila, she brought a letter from First Lady Imelda Marcos inviting Kwok to bring a youth orchestra to perform as part of the festival to celebrate the opening of the massive cultural center of the Philippines. And this was in the autumn of 1969. So according to Liu Changbo, who was working in the Ministry of Education's Cultural Affairs Office, a good deal of the impetus for the orchestra's trip to the Philippines came from the support of eminent writer and philosopher Lin Yutang, who happened to be in Taiwan in the summer of 1969. Kwok invited him to hear her rehearse a youth orchestra in Tainan, during which he became determined to make the tour to the Philippines a reality. Lin hoped that Kwok might, in his words, quote, prepare for international consumption a musical version of the so-called Manchu Han imperial feast, end quote. He believed that, quote, such a display of talent would surely surprise and shake up the international musical world, end quote. Lin immediately contacted the Cultural Affairs Office and put forth a proposal that was approved and forwarded to the legislature, where it received the enthusiastic approval of both the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Overseas Community Affairs Office. Soon, the legislature approved the project and ordered the Cultural Affairs Office to make preparations for the tour. Why did the government undertake such a project? Liu Changpo offered the following explanation, quote, at that time, the circumstances surrounding our diplomatic relations witnessed the increasing threat of isolation. The Chinese communists were using ping-pong diplomacy in the United States and sports diplomacy. There was no harm in our nation trying musical foreign diplomacy to counter and stage a surprise attack. This would certainly make international audiences recognize our nation's potential and marvel at our progress, end quote. 2 nights before flying to Manila, the orchestra gave a concert in central Taipei. Whoa, just a second. In central Taipei. Even though it was a rainy evening, the house was packed with more than 2,000 attendees. Also in attendance that evening were numerous nationalist government officials. Philippine Senator Helena Benitez was also present. The China Times reported that the packed audience went crazy over the orchestra's wonderful playing. They simply would not stop clapping until the orchestra played an encore, and even then, Kwok made 7 curtain calls before the audience finally dispersed. Within 8 or so hours of leaving Taipei, the CSO arrived at the Malacañang Presidential Palace, where they performed at the birthday party for the Marcos's 9-year-old daughter. Both President Ferdinand Marcos and First Lady Imelda were in attendance, along with a gaggle of children and representatives from the overseas Chinese community. At the party, 8-year-old Xin Mingfeng, who quickly became one of the tour's featured stars, sang 2 patriotic songs in a bright voice and excellent intonation. On the evening of September 17th, the CSO gave the performance around which the entire tour had been organized. The 2,000-seat auditorium of the Cultural Center was filled to capacity. At the program's end, all attention turned to Imelda Marcos, who was seated in a box in the hall's first ring. When 2 of the orchestra's tiniest members went to take gifts to Imelda, quote, First Lady Imelda Marcos clasped the hand of one of the kids and took about 7 minutes as she led them down from the 2nd floor to the stage. She shook the hand of the conductor, Helen Kwok, and then that of every one of the players. She praised them lavishly. At Mrs. Marcos' suggestion, Xin Mingfeng once again sang the patriotic song, Free China Youth. Time limitations prevent further discussion of all of the CSO's other concerts and activities during their visit. Suffice to say that the media in Taiwan continued to report on the CSO's reception, especially details of diplomatic or perceived political significance. Of particular interest, it seems, was a performance for an audience of overseas Chinese. The orchestra's interaction with these community members were detailed in the press back in Taiwan. Once the CSO returned to Taiwan, the Cultural Affairs Office hosted a welcoming party, cum media event, and award ceremony at the prestigious Ambassador Hotel in downtown Taipei. Headlining the event was presentations of gifts from Chiang Kai-shek's wife to Helen, the staff, and the children. And I have a video here, hopefully I can make it go, of Xin Mingfeng, the one who was the cute little 8-year-old who had been singing patriotic songs, as he is showing me pictures from his family scrapbook of the award ceremony. And just as a side note, I'm borrowing Jocelyn Gilbo's methodology of having our informants look at pictures to help jog their memories as part of the interview method.
Where's the medal? I don't know. They gave us. And then I was made to sing, I guess. Yeah, I see. So that's that.
So by way of conclusion, I take a brief look at a parallel instance of the nationalist government using high-performing children as agents of diplomacy. The Republic of China Children's Symphony Orchestra took off from Taipei's Songshan Airport for the Philippines 9 days after the storied Jinlong baseball team landed to a hero's welcome at the Little League Baseball World Champions. The notion that these young musicians, like the Jinlong athletes, represented the best of the nation on the international stage was fresh in the minds of the young musicians and government officials alike. Even Chiang Kai-shek compared the orchestra and the baseball team, saying, quote, both evidence the high intelligence of Chinese people, particularly they embody the spirit of cooperation and moral integrity. End quote. There were obvious parallels in the ways in which the ROC government employed these gifted youngsters to support their ideological purposes. First, the most obvious of these was simply the value in having outstanding ROC citizens appear in foreign venues. All the better if they were children, since this represented the promise of the nation's bright future. Simply put, this forwarded the claim that the ROC, in exile on Taiwan, was the better of the two Chinas, or more appropriate to the times, they were the legitimate Chinese administration, proof of which was that their citizens were prospering. Second, on the domestic front, the success of these young citizens provided something around which the nation could rally. This was evidenced by the sellout crowds at the concerts of downtown Taipei and the Taiwanese media's heavy and detailed coverage of the orchestra's activities in the Philippines. The mania surrounding the ROC participation in the Little League Baseball World Series is legendary. Third, the government took full advantage of both the orchestra's presence in the Philippines and the baseball team's time in the United States to garner support from overseas Chinese communities. For the struggling nationalist regime, the overseas Chinese communities were potentially very powerful in terms of both local connections that could aid brokerage with foreign governments and in terms of finances. Like the events staged for the orchestra with overseas Chinese in the Philippines, the ROC ambassador to the United States organized similar events whenever the Little League players arrived. While the CSO tour was the first to involve an orchestra of gifted young musicians being sent on a diplomatic tour, it certainly was not the last. The next high-profile tour was dispatched in 1976 to the United States, where the R.M.A. Orchestra, also led by Helen Kwok, performed in more than 25 venues around the country as part of the USA's bicentennial celebrations. A review of R.M.A.'s performance at Lincoln Center in New York City, published in Musical America, opened, quote, with so much attention being paid to communist China during the last few years, Americans may be forgetting the treasures that nationalist China has to offer, end quote. Concert tours and baseball teams all played a role in the Republic of China's strategy for providing its citizens a focus for the national pride and remaining present in the international arena. Thank you.
Okay, so the floor is essentially open for questions, and if you just put on chat to everyone whom you want the question to go to, and we'll start from there. David, could you respond to the question, how does your presentation relate to Native Hawaiian music or things Native Hawaiian?
Well, I'll say at the outset that even though I spent those 2 good years with you at UH, I'm certainly not an expert in the politics of the ancient Hawaiian music and movement. But I will say that I can see so many points of connection there. In fact, it takes me to Henry's comment just before he began his paper. Henry, I thought that it was so smart to recognize that one of the things Ms. Smith has done is to use her white privilege in order to open up space for other people. And I think that, that could be something to draw out of this particular question in relation to the Hawaiian music and arts, how it is that allies have helped along the way and also cleared space and made it possible for others to take over. So that's what's on my mind about it. Again, not from a place of great expertise, but of a curiosity.
Thank you, David. Let's go on. Fred has a question for Nancy. Fred Lau.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you for your great presentation. My question is, does Helen Kwok's South Vietnamese background have anything to do with, her being hired as a spokesman for the ROC?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I actually have no idea. She was educated in Australia, and she already was pretty successful. So, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, it can't hurt that she had this already international profile, and that's certainly something good for the regime to put forward. her being in alliance with them. In my footnote, which I didn't have time to talk about, she won an international conducting competition and was Leonard Bernstein's assistant in the New York Philharmonic for a while. So she really was very high profile, and that all goes well with that theme. Oh, I just want to add one thing, and that is that there wouldn't have been anyone in Taiwan at the time who would have had that facility. So.
Okay. Andrew Weintraub has a question for Henry.
Henry, great paper. I wanted to ask you about von Hornbostel and Kunst, rather than thinking about what they were doing as right or wrong, which of course they thought about their methods that way. But as we know, they were really fudging the song, especially in terms of their methods of listening to the tones and matching them to the monochord and not having a very large sample available. Mm-hmm. And so how much were Kunst and von Hornbostel sort of like the Javanese people that Seuss was describing, in the way that they were trying to get something that they felt really comfortable with? And, you know, so this, like, de-essentializing the story about the West as science and the Javanese as more about feeling and individuality and things like that.
Well, Andrew, I think that both Kunst and Hornbostel were trying to nudge their measurements to fit the theory that they were going on. And if they absolutely couldn't get that to happen, then they kind of nudged the theory a little bit to make that match up. I've actually done a few exercises trying to actually match their calculations. And I find them to be, well, not wildly off. They're off by as much as 10 cents sometimes. Even given the numbers that they provide, forget whether or not they actually measured things correctly, but just doing the calculations is often, things don't add up the way they're supposed to. So I think they spent a lot of time trying to make it work in a way that they wanted it to work. And for a while, at least, they did. Thanks, Andrew.
We have another question actually for Henry, so don't go away, Henry. This is Made Hood had a question.
Thanks for revisiting the often underrepresented musical phenomenon, or the music itself, which seems to be making kind of a resurface in ethnomusicology. I really like your description of these degrees of comfortability that Susilo had mentioned. I remember him talking about that. Did you get a sense from younger Sundanese musicians, and perhaps those that are interested in the diversity of tuning in Sunda, of course, Patsus, Central Java, is there that kind of concept in Sunda locally? And what are young people talking about now?
I don't know about young people, but when I was a young person, then I know what some of those people were thinking. And they recognized that different context called for different nuances in intonation. So there was really, and I mean, much the way that Western music works, there's no one right way to play a pitch. It really depends on what's going on around it. And so trying to get me to do that, or trying to tell other people how, oh, that's not quite right, or it doesn't sound, usually they use sort of an emotional term or a term for an emotion rather than it's too sharp or too flat. And I do remember my Rabab teacher, who was definitely not a young person, but when he didn't like what I was playing, he said it was bau diatonis. It smelled like diatonic tuning. Mm-hmm. And so he was trying to get me not to do that by kind of casting aspersions on it, I guess, saying it stunk. Hope that helps a little bit. Thanks for the question, Made, and thanks for letting me read it before you asked it.
Thank you.
Okay, David, this is
actually, can I just say one thing? Made also was the one who released the recording that we heard on that video of Kusumadinata playing the Rabab. So thank you for that also, Made.
This is from Isaac Ibude to David. Isaac, are you there? Or Isaac, sorry.
Isaac, you are correct.
Yes. Could you ask your question?
My question has to do with how do we engage in activism as an ethnomusicologists, especially to bring about change in policy on environmental pollution due to oil exploration in the Niger Delta, where I live in Nigeria.
Well, I'm moved by the specificity of your question, because obviously this is something you care about deeply, and that's step number one, obviously. You know, activism is impossible until we recognize the things that truly matter to us. And so now you've passed step one and beyond because you know what you care about. There are so many beautiful examples of the use of music, certainly, to assist in arts activism projects. Sometimes it's about public music, it's about rabble rousing, it's about music as noise, it's about music as attracting attention. And sometimes it's very specific about taking a cause directly to the people who can make a difference in that cause. And that might require the writing of new music or the presentation of music that has a message. And there are great examples of that, certainly in the last century, and we see so many examples of it right now in relation to the protests that are surrounding the deaths of George Floyd and others. So I think that it begins with the decision, this is the thing I care about, and then secondarily, it's about using all your creativity and the methods at your own fingertips in order to imagine how it is that you could take the issue and make it evident to others in a way that will make them want to make change with you. And I can see actually, I don't know you, I haven't met you before, but I can see that you're a person who has strong convictions. And I hope that those convictions can translate into change.
A question from Rebecca Stewart, or Becky as I know her, and I guess it goes to, actually, to Made, a question to Made from Rebecca.
Hello, Made. I don't know if you were a very little boy when I was your father's research assistant for 1 year at UCLA. And or maybe you weren't even born, I can't remember now. But I just, when you were talking, I was seeing your father, but, and your mother. And I was remembering that for 9 months, I was your father's research assistant, and I would go to his house and measure, based on thousands of examples, the difference between Slendero and Pelog. And at the end of that wonderful experience, we came to no conclusions whatsoever. And what my conclusion from that was that exactly as Mr. Fuller said, it is more or less comfortable. And I have spent much of the rest of my life working with this principle. And that is that in the West, we think of tones. And with my work, non-Western music, especially with Indian music, we work with intervals. And those intervals are constantly alive and changing. And even with xylophones, metallophones, this happens, as you know. What do you think about that?
Well, thank you for the comment, and thank you for sharing the memory of my father and being a researcher. Of course, he was a student of Jaap Kunst, and your memory kind of brings up in this context of honoring Barbara today, the kind of lineage and the big family that I see in front of us here in the Zoom conversation. I think all of us are very appreciative of the fact that there's an indeterminate way to describe the sounds that we enjoy and that we try and appreciate and open and expand our ears, and locking it down to one system. I think, you know, the biology of our musics around the world resist that. And I think Henry's paper does a very nice job of saying how appreciative we have to be in trying to figure out amongst the people that we study music with, what is that comfortability, and appreciating that diversity of being comfortable right around the world. So thanks for that question.
Thank you for the question and the answer, and for bringing in a larger discussion. At this time, I'd like to invite our honoree, Barbara Smith, to either comment or ask questions of our speakers. As you can see, Barbara is very comfortable in her room with her assistant, so that she will be able to hear us if we speak slowly.
Well, I had hoped to be able to ask the same question to all of the three speakers, but with the intelligent and wide-ranging questions that have already come up, I think I better just make a comment to each of them. But the one thing that carries through all of these is the fact that everything comes down to the people who make the music. It's not just the sound themselves, but rather that it's the people. And I thought of my own teaching as guiding my students in the learning, because I didn't know enough about ethnomusicology, but I liked Rick's way of expressing it even better, that he was thinking of his teaching, well, his work with students as teaching students or people through ethnomusicology rather than teaching them directly ethnomusicology. And the wide range of the speakers today would seem to well confirm the wisdom and the effectiveness of that statement. So that seems to be very effective or applicable to David's, because what he's teaching now is not called ethnomusicology, but something else. And in the case of Henry, I'm wondering if the tendency to accept the different tunings in gamelans is what leads to their, that the instrument ensemble per se has a name. And one that we have here in Hawaii, Venerable and Love, seems to be very appropriate to some of the students I know who are in it. Well, you know, people who've been in it for years, that they really want to continue playing it. And then for Nancy's paper, I was thinking of the fact that so many people want to use music for their own purposes, and that's fine, whether it's just individuals or nations. And I remember that many years ago, when someone from the mainland in a prominent position came over, and I mentioned that my interest was in not non-Western music, but the people outside. And her answer was, we are very interested in having our music, Western music, of course, known by people elsewhere. So anyhow, I thank you, all the three speakers, very, very much for your enlightening, very perceptive papers. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Let's close this session, that is the formal session with the three papers, with a reminder that this is only one of a series of 7 webinars that we are doing to celebrate Barbara. I was worried about Barbara having to sit through 7 sessions, one after the other, for 2 days. This way, she only has to sit through one once a month, and it makes the celebration longer and less taxing. So our next session will be always on the 10th of the month. Remember that. July 10th will be our next session here, and you will receive the link to that 2 days before the actual meeting. And I hope you all got the booklet that was sent to you last night. If you didn't get the booklet, please email me and I'll have one sent to you. That is the booklet for the entire webinar series. So then it gives me great pleasure then to close the formal first panel session and thank our 3 speakers for their presentations that show really the wide range of things that Barbara has been responsible for making us think about. So thanks again for this session.